In the glass-walled boardroom of VeraCore's 32nd floor, a quietly determined engineer was about to challenge everything the tech world believed about leadership. What started as a routine CEO application took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the woman who had stolen her innovations and laughed at her ambitions. Naomi Ibarra wasn't your typical corporate climber. For 7 years, she had spent her life building VeraCore from the ground up, known for her brilliant AI ethics framework and her ability to see patterns others missed. When she encountered Claire Roth's dismissive laughter echoing through that conference room, she had no idea she was walking into the moment that would define her entire career. Naomi's composed smile and quiet dignity would lead to consequences that would shake Silicon Valley to its core. What began as public humiliation would become a masterclass in strategic patience. The tech industry would never be the same after witnessing how quiet competence could triumph over performative power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The moment Claire Roth finished reading my CEO application aloud to the executive team, I knew exactly how this would change. She leaned back in that overpriced Herman Miller chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and started laughing, not the polite corporate chuckle you use when someone makes a mildly amusing comment during a budget meeting, but the kind of genuine belly laugh that makes your eyes water and your shoulders shake, like I had just told her the most ridiculous joke she'd heard all year. Women like Naomi should focus on what they're actually good at, she said, wiping actual tears from her eyes while gesturing dismissively at the 50-page strategic plan I'd spent 3 months crafting. Honestly, considering her track record here, I think she'd be much better suited for a senior engineering role, maybe a nice VP of product development position where she can stay in her lane and do what she does best, which is building things quietly in the background without having to worry about the real pressures of leadership. I sat there in that glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of VeraCore's sleek downtown San Francisco headquarters, watching her perform for an audience of men who nodded along with varying degrees of enthusiasm while outside floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below us in all its complicated glory, and I smiled warmly, the same genuine smile I'd been perfecting for years. The one that said, "I value your feedback and I'm grateful for your honesty," even when what I really wanted to do was lean forward and ask Claire to explain exactly which part of my plan she found so amusing, because here's what she didn't know, and what none of them knew, sitting around that polished mahogany table with their expensive suits and their carefully curated LinkedIn profiles. I had helped build VeraCore from the ground up back when it was just 4 engineers working out of a cramped co-working space in Soma, back when Claire was still trying to figure out how to pitch our AI platform to investors without using too much technical jargon, back when our biggest concern was whether we could afford to keep the lights on for another month. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I gathered my presentation materials, thanked Claire for taking the time to review my application, and told her I really appreciated her perspective on my career development. Then I stood up, smoothed down my navy blazer, and walked out of that conference room with the same quiet dignity I'd been carrying around for the past 5 years. The only person who didn't laugh was Elliot Tran, our most senior board member, who sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, and that expression he gets when he's thinking 3 moves ahead in whatever complex game everyone else is too busy performing to notice. Elliot had worked with me at my previous company before VeraCore existed, before Claire had ever heard of artificial intelligence or venture capital or any of the buzzwords she now threw around like she invented them personally. As I walked past him toward the door, Elliot caught my eye for just a fraction of a second and gave me the smallest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that could mean anything or nothing depending on who was watching. Then he pulled out his phone and started typing something that looked important enough to require immediate attention. What Claire and the rest of them didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for this moment for longer than any of them imagined. Not just the CEO application or the strategic plan or even the 3-year vision document I'd submitted alongside my formal candidacy, but the slow, methodical process of understanding exactly what VeraCore needed to survive its next phase of growth, and exactly why Claire's approach to leadership was systematically destroying everything we'd built together. because while she'd been busy cultivating her image as the brilliant, single-handedly transformed a scrappy startup into a major player in the AI ethics space, I'd been watching from a distance, studying the quarterly reports and the employee satisfaction surveys and the turnover rates that kept climbing, despite our record-breaking revenue numbers. I'd been having quiet conversations with former colleagues who left VeraCore citing culture issues and lack of advancement opportunities. I'd been reading the Glassdoor reviews that painted a picture of a company where innovation happened despite leadership, not because of it, and I'd been tracking the subtle shifts in our industry partnerships that suggested other companies were starting to view VeraCore as difficult to work with. But most importantly, I'd been building relationships with the people who actually mattered, the board members who'd grown increasingly concerned about our internal stability, the investors who'd started asking pointed questions about executive turnover, and the industry leaders who remembered what VeraCore used to represent before it became another Silicon Valley success story obsessed with its own mythology. So when Claire finished laughing at my ambition and the meeting moved on other agenda items, I walked back to my temporary desk in the consulting space they'd given me for this transition period and opened my laptop to find 3 new emails, 2 interview requests from AI ethics publications, and a calendar invitation from Marcus Feldman for something called strategic planning sessions scheduled for later that week. The subject line was deliberately vague, but the attendee list told me everything I needed to know. It was just Marcus and Elliot, and one other name I recognized from the board directory. Someone who hadn't been in today's meeting. Someone who might be very interested in hearing a different perspective on VeraCore's future leadership needs. I smiled again, this time for real, and started drafting my response. Let me take you back to the beginning, because understanding what happened in that boardroom requires understanding what came before it, requires knowing who I was when I first walked into VeraCore's original office space 7 years ago. With my MIT computer science degree still fresh in my mind, and absolutely no idea that I was about to help build something that would fundamentally change how companies think about artificial intelligence, I was 26 years old, and probably the most naive person in the entire Bay Area tech scene, which is saying something considering how many 20-something Stanford graduates were convinced they were going to revolutionize everything from food delivery to dating apps. I believed that good work spoke for itself, that innovation would be recognized and rewarded fairly, and that building something meaningful was more important than building something that looked impressive on TechCrunch. Claire was 32 then, and already displaying the sharp intelligence and strategic thinking that would eventually make her one of the most quoted executives in our industry. She'd joined VeraCore about 6 months before me after leaving a senior engineering role at Google, and she immediately became the person everyone turned to when we needed to translate our technical capabilities into language that investors and clients could understand. Those first 2 years were incredible in ways I'm still trying to process. We were working 18-hour days fueled by terrible coffee and the kind of shared purpose that makes you forget you're living on ramen and hope we were building something genuinely revolutionary. An AI platform that could analyze ethical implications of automated decision-making in real time, helping companies avoid the algorithmic bias disasters that were starting to dominate tech headlines. And I was good at it, better than good actually. I had this intuitive understanding of how to make machine learning models were both sophisticated and transparent, which turned out to be exactly what the market needed. I could see patterns in data that other engineers missed, and I had a gift for explaining complex technical concepts in ways that made sense to non-technical stakeholders. Claire recognized my ability immediately and took me under her wing in a way that felt like mentorship, like someone finally seeing my potential and wanting to help me develop it. She included me in client meetings, started asking for my input on strategic decisions, and made me feel like I was part of something bigger than just another tech startup, trying to disrupt an industry that probably didn't need disrupting. But somewhere around year 3 things started shifting in ways that were so subtle I didn't notice them at first. Claire would take my technical innovations and present them in board meetings without mentioning my contributions. She'd rework my client proposals and submit them under her name, She'd invite me to brainstorming sessions, then show up to the next meeting with fully formed strategies that sounded suspiciously like our collaborative discussions. When I brought this up during our weekly one-on-one, she'd smile and remind me that everything we did was team effort, that individual credit mattered less than collective success, that I was still learning how to communicate with senior leadership. And she was helping me by ensuring our best ideas got the attention they deserved. I wanted to believe her, because the alternative meant acknowledging that someone I trusted, someone I looked up to, someone who'd made me feel capable and valued, was systematically erasing my contributions to our shared work, and I wasn't ready to accept that reality. Not when we were so close to achieving everything we dreamed about when we first started working together. The breaking point came during our Series B funding round, when Claire presented our AI ethics framework to a room full of venture capitalists as her original innovation. The framework I'd spent 8 months developing, the methodology that would become VeraCore's signature offering, the intellectual property that would eventually generate over $40 million in revenue. I sat in the back of that conference room listening to her explain concepts I'd pioneered using language I'd written in papers she'd never read, and I felt something inside me just snap. Not into anger exactly, but into a kind of cold clarity about who Claire really was, and what our relationship had always been. After the presentation, when the VCs were congratulating her on her brilliance and her vision, I approached her privately and asked if she thought it might be appropriate to mention my role in developing the framework. She looked at me with this expression of mild confusion, like I was a child who didn't understand how professional collaboration worked. "Naomi," she said gently, "you have to understand that when you're dealing with investors and board members, they need to see clear leadership. They need to know who's driving the vision and who's responsible for execution. If I start talking about collaborative development and shared ownership, it muddies the message and undermines confidence in our ability to deliver results." I nodded and smiled and thanked her for explaining that to me. Then I went home to my studio apartment in the Mission and spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, wondering when I'd become so small in my own life. 3 months later, the health scare happened. Stress-induced panic attacks that felt like heart attacks, emergency room visits that revealed dangerously high blood pressure in someone who should have been at peak physical health. My doctor used words like burnout and unsustainable, and strongly recommended taking extended time off to focus on recovery. I submitted my leave of absence request on a Thursday, and the following Monday, Claire had already started redistributing my projects to other team members, as if my contributions had been easily replaceable, all along, as if the innovations that had helped secure our funding and establish our market position could be seamlessly absorbed into other people's workflows. That's when I realized that leaving VeraCore wasn't just necessary for my health, it was necessary for my sanity and my sense of self-worth, because staying meant accepting a version of myself that was small and grateful and invisible, and I wasn't ready to disappear completely. Walking back into VeraCore 5 years later felt like returning to a place that had been preserved in amber. Everything looked exactly the same, from the exposed brick walls and the artfully arranged succulents to the motivational quotes printed on expensive paper and mounted in minimalist frames. But underneath the familiar aesthetics, there was something different in the air, something that felt heavier and more cautious than the collaborative energy. I remembered the first person I ran into was Layla Monroe, who'd been hired as HR coordinator around the time I left, and had apparently worked her way up to head of people operations. She was standing by the espresso machine that probably cost more than my car, looking tired in the way that only comes from dealing with difficult personalities for extended periods of time. When she saw me, her face lit up with genuine surprise and what looked like relief. "Naomi," she said, pulling me into a hug that lasted just long enough to feel meaningful. "I heard you were back for the CEO interviews. How are you feeling about everything?" That's when I knew something significant had shifted, because the Layla I remembered from 5 years ago was diplomatic and careful about discussing internal politics, the kind of HR professional who'd mastered the art of listening without commenting. But this Layla looked like someone who'd been carrying around secrets that were becoming too heavy to hold alone. We ended up having coffee in one of the small conference rooms where she proceeded to download 5 years' worth of organizational dysfunction with the systematic precision of someone who'd been documenting everything for potential legal purposes. The turnover rate in engineering is up 40% from when you left, she told me, stirring her oat milk latte with more force than necessary. We've lost 3 senior women in the past 18 months, all citing culture issues and lack of advancement opportunities. The exit interviews are consistent enough to establish patterns. Pulled out her phone and showed me a spreadsheet that looked like evidence in a discrimination lawsuit. Columns tracking hiring practices, promotion rates, salary disparities, and retention numbers broken down by gender and department. The data painted a picture of a company that had systematically pushed out anyone who might challenge Claire's authority. But here's what's really interesting. Layla continued, lowering her voice even though we were alone. The board's been asking questions not just about the numbers but about specific incidents. There've been complaints, formal ones, that went directly to Marcus instead of through normal HR channels. I felt my pulse quicken because I knew Marcus Feldman well enough to understand that he didn't involve himself in operational issues unless something threatened the company's reputation or legal standing. If board members were fielding direct complaints about executive behavior, it meant the situation had escalated beyond normal corporate dysfunction. That afternoon I took a walk through the office space, trying to see it through fresh eyes, noting the subtle changes that revealed how the culture had evolved. The way people huddled in small groups during lunch breaks, speaking in hushed tones, the way conversations stopped when certain executives walked past, the way the engineering team seemed to work with their heads down, avoiding unnecessary interaction. But I also noticed something else. Something that gave me hope. The quality of work being produced was still exceptional. The innovation labs were buzzing with projects that could revolutionize our industry, and there were younger employees who radiated the same passionate energy I'd felt during my early years at VeraCore. They just seemed isolated from leadership, disconnected decision-making processes that should have been leveraging their insights. Around 4 o'clock, Elliot Tran appeared at my temporary workspace with 2 cups of coffee and that knowing smile that meant he had information worth sharing. "Interesting day," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I heard you had quite the audience for your CEO presentation this morning." I kept my expression neutral because I'd learned over the years that Elliot collected information, the way other people collected vintage wines, carefully, systematically, and with deep appreciation for nuance. If he was bringing this up, it meant he'd already formed opinions about what had transpired. Claire certainly made her position clear. I replied, accepting the coffee and waiting to see where he'd take the conversation. "She did indeed," he said, "but what she doesn't know is that I submitted your name for CEO consideration 3 weeks ago, along with a detailed recommendation letter outlining why you're exactly what this company needs to navigate its next growth phase." I nearly choked on my coffee because in all my planning and preparation for this transition, I'd never imagined that someone had been advocating for me behind the scenes, that my candidacy wasn't just wishful thinking, but part of a larger strategic conversation happening at board level. "The formal interview process starts next week," Elliot continued, "but between you and me, the real decision-making happened months ago when we started analyzing what went wrong with our last 2 retention reports. Marcus is convinced we need fresh leadership, someone who understands both the technical foundations and the cultural challenges." He leaned forward, conspiratorially, and lowered his voice. "Claire thinks she's untouchable because she's delivered strong financial results, but she's never understood that sustainable growth requires sustainable culture, and sustainable culture requires leaders who build people up instead of tearing them down." My heart was racing, because this conversation was confirming everything I'd hoped, but hadn't dared to assume, that my observations about VeraCore's internal dysfunction aligned with board-level concerns, that my vision for collaborative leadership wasn't just idealistic nonsense, but potentially exactly what the company needed. "There's a board meeting scheduled for Friday," Elliot said, standing up and smoothing down his jacket. Where we'll be discussing final candidates for the CEO position. I think you should know that your application is being taken very seriously by people who matter. After he left, I sat there staring at my laptop screen, trying to process the fact that while Claire had been performing her dismissal for an audience of executives, the real power brokers were already having completely different conversations about VeraCore's future, conversations that apparently included my name in ways I'd never imagined possible. That evening, I called my father like I did every Tuesday and told him about the day's events, carefully omitting the part about board discussions, but sharing my general sense that something significant was shifting. "You sound different, Mija," he said in that gentle way he had of reading between the lines. "More confident, like you're finally ready to step into the space you've been preparing for." I realized he was right. I did feel different, more grounded in my own worth, more certain about my vision for leadership, more ready to fight for something I believed in, instead of just hoping others would recognize my contributions. Whatever happens next, I told him, I know I'm ready for it, and for the first time in 5 years, I actually believed that was true. The boardroom on the 34th floor felt different at 7:30 in the morning, when it was just me and my presentation materials, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to bet everything on a single conversation. I'd arrived early deliberately, because I wanted those few minutes alone to center myself, to run through my key points one final time, and to absorb the gravity of what was about to happen. Marcus Feldman walked in precisely at 8, followed by Elliot and 3 other board members. I recognized from company photos but had never spoken to directly. They settled around the table with their coffee and tablets, that polite but distant expression that successful executives wear when they're evaluating someone's worthiness for their inner circle. I stood at the front of the room next to the massive wall-mounted display, feeling simultaneously like I belonged there, and like I was about to be exposed as someone who'd somehow wandered into the wrong meeting. But when I started talking about VeraCore's future, something interesting happened. My voice steadied, my thoughts organized themselves, and I remembered why I'd fallen in love with this company in the first place. My presentation wasn't flashy or filled with the kind of buzzwords that usually populate corporate strategy sessions. Instead, I talked about sustainable growth, built on authentic innovation, about creating an environment where our best people wanted to stay and build their careers, about positioning VeraCore as the company that other organizations look to for guidance on ethical AI development. I showed them data they'd never seen before, retention statistics cross-referenced with project success rates, employee satisfaction surveys, correlated with client renewal percentages, turnover costs, calculated against the true value of institutional knowledge, and what the numbers revealed was a company that was succeeding despite its leadership practices. Not because of them. 15 minutes into my presentation, I noticed that Marcus had stopped looking at his phone. Elliot was taking notes, and the other board members were leaning forward with the kind of attention that meant they were hearing something that resonated with concerns they'd been privately harboring. Then I heard the conference room door open behind me, and Claire's voice cutting through the air, like she was arriving to handle some sort of crisis that required her immediate intervention. "I'm so sorry I'm late," she announced with the breathless energy of someone who'd clearly rushed upstairs after learning about a meeting she wasn't supposed to know about. "I just heard that Naomi was presenting this morning, and I thought it would be helpful if someone from current leadership was here to provide context and answer any questions about operational realities." I turned around to see her standing in the doorway, wearing a perfectly tailored blazer and an expression that suggested she was doing everyone a favor by gracing them with her presence. Marcus, annoyed at the interruption, but gestured for her to take a seat while I stood there, trying to decide whether to continue my presentation or acknowledge the elephant that had just walked into the room. "Please continue," Marcus said to me, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was more interested in observing how I'd handle this disruption than in hearing the rest of my strategic vision, so I continued talking about our 3-year growth plan, while Claire sat there, radiating disapproval and occasionally making small sighs or headshakes that were clearly designed to undermine my credibility. without being overtly disrespectful when I mentioned our employee retention challenges. She actually laughed out loud. "I'm sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all, "but I think we need to address the fundamental disconnect between what Naomi is proposing and the realities of running a competitive technology company in today's market. The employee satisfaction metrics she's citing are interesting academic exercises, but they don't necessarily correlate with business success." Elliot looked up from his notes with that expression he gets when someone has just said something particularly stupid, and Marcus shifted in his chair in a way that suggested his patience was wearing thin, but I decided to treat Claire's interruption as an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership approach I'd been advocating. "That's an excellent point, Claire," I said with genuine warmth, "and you're absolutely right that we need to balance employee satisfaction with business performance, which is why I've included ROI projections for every culture initiative I'm proposing here. Let me show you how retention improvements translate directly to cost savings and productivity gain." I clicked to the next slide, which displayed a comprehensive analysis of how toxic workplace culture was costing VeraCore approximately $2.3 million annually in turnover costs, lost productivity, and damaged client relationships. The numbers were devastating and undeniable because I'd spent weeks verifying every calculation. Claire's face went through several interesting color changes as she realized that I'd essentially built a financial case study around her leadership failures without ever mentioning her name, but Marcus was nodding with the kind of recognition that comes from seeing your instincts validated by hard data. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need," Elliot said, looking directly at Claire. "Our retention problems aren't just HR issues, they're fundamental business challenges that require leadership willing to prioritize long-term sustainability over short-term performance metrics." Claire tried to recover by questioning my technical qualifications for CEO, suggesting that someone with my background might be better suited for a chief technology officer role, where I could focus on innovation without having to worry about the complexities of executive decision-making. That's when Marcus finally lost patience with her disruption strategy. "Claire," he said in the tone that board chairs use when they're about to end careers, "I think we have enough context about operational realities. Thank you for your input, but I'd like to let Naomi finish her presentation without further interruption." The rest of my presentation went smoothly, covering everything from client acquisition strategies to international expansion plans, and by the time I concluded 45 minutes later, I could see that I'd shifted something fundamental in how these board members viewed both my capabilities and Claire's judgment. After I left the room, I could hear raised voices through the conference room door. Claire's distinctive laugh when nervous sound mixing with Marcus's increasingly stern tone and Elliot's measured but pointed questions about executive accountability. I walked back my temporary desk feeling like I'd just taken the most important test of my professional life, and while I couldn't be certain about the results, I knew I'd represented myself and my vision authentically. That afternoon, Elliot stopped by my workspace with coffee and news. "The board's going into closed deliberations tomorrow," he said, "but I want you to know that your presentation today was exactly what they needed to hear about VeraCore's future." I thanked him for his support and asked what I should expect next. "Honestly," he replied, "I think you should expect some very interesting conversations the next few days. Conversations that might surprise everyone involved, including you." The call came at 6:47 on Friday morning while I was making coffee in my kitchen and trying not to obsess over everything that had happened during the board's closed deliberations the day before. Had left a voicemail asking me to be available for a conference call with board leadership at 7 sharp, which could have meant anything from congratulations to condolences. I answered on the first ring, trying to sound more awake and confident than I felt given that I'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of my presentation, looking for signs that I'd either secured or destroyed my chances. "Naomi," Marcus said without preamble, "we need to discuss something that came up during our deliberations yesterday. Something that changes the context of our selection process in ways we didn't anticipate." My heart started racing, because in my experience, unexpected context changes usually meant someone had discovered disqualifying information about your background or your references had revealed unflattering details about your character or work ethic. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It turns out Elliot continued that there are voting shares in VeraCore that we weren't fully accounting for legacy shares from our original funding round that have been held quietly by someone who's never participated in board discussions or strategic decisions. I was confused because I thought I understood VeraCore's ownership structure. From my research into the company's funding history, I'd reviewed SEC filings and investor disclosures, and nothing had indicated significant voting shares held by silent partners. The shares belonged to David Ibarra, Marcus said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this revelation had surprised him as much as anyone. David invested in VeraCore during our Series A round, but he maintained such a low profile that most of us forgot about his voting rights until our legal team reviewed the bylaws yesterday. I nearly dropped my coffee cup because David Ibarra was my father and the idea that he held voting shares in VeraCore was news to me. We'd never discussed his invest portfolio in detail, and he'd certainly never mentioned having any stake in the company where I'd built my early career. Apparently your father has abstained from all previous board decisions. Marcus continued, but according to our charter, his shares carry voting weight in executive appointments, with the board currently split 4-4 between you and Claire. His vote becomes the deciding factor. I was trying to process this information while simultaneously wondering if my father had somehow orchestrated this entire situation from behind the scenes. If his mysterious investment in VeraCore had been part of some long-term strategy to position me for leadership opportunity. But that didn't align with everything I knew about David Ibarra's approach to business and parenting. He'd spent my entire childhood emphasizing the importance of earning recognition through merit, rather than connections of building credibility through competence, rather than networking of never relying on family influence to advance my career. Marcus was still talking, explaining that they'd reached out to my father the previous evening to inform him about the board's deadlock and to ask whether he wanted to participate in the final vote. He was very clear that he doesn't want to influence our decision-making process, Marcus said, but he also understands his fiduciary responsibility to the company and to other shareholders, so he's agreed to submit his vote based purely on what he believes is best for VeraCore's future. I asked whether my father knew I was one of the candidates being considered, and Marcus confirmed that they'd disclosed the full context, including my presentation and the board's deliberations. He seemed surprised to learn about your candidacy. Elliot added, but he didn't ask for any details about your qualifications or your vision for the company. He simply said he'd review the materials we'd already discussed and make his decision accordingly. There was a long pause while I tried to figure out how to respond to this surreal turn of events. The idea that my professional future might depend on my father's assessment of my capabilities felt both deeply uncomfortable and oddly appropriate, given how much his quiet wisdom had shaped my approach to leadership. We'll have his decision by end of business today, Marcus said, and we'll convene a final board meeting Monday morning to announce our choice for CEO. In the meantime, I want you to know that your presentation yesterday was exceptional, regardless of how this particular vote unfolds. After the call ended, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, thinking about the strange symmetry of this moment, how my father's invisible influence was suddenly becoming visible in ways that could either validate or undermine everything I'd worked to achieve. Around noon, I got a text message from a number I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakably my father's characteristic blend of affection and gentle guidance. Nisha, I'm proud of the leader you've become. The company is lucky to have someone with your vision and integrity. Voting my conscience today. Love, Papa. I stared at that message for a long time because it told me everything I needed to know about his decision without explicitly stating it. And it reminded me that sometimes the most powerful support comes from people who believe in you enough to let you succeed or fail on your own merits. That evening, Marcus called again with news that the board had received David's vote and would be meeting Monday morning to formalize the CEO appointment. "I have to ask," he said, "did you know about your father's investment in VeraCore?" "Honestly," a reply, "had no idea, and I'm not sure whether that makes this situation better or more complicated." Marcus laughed for the first time since I'd known him. "It makes it interesting," he said, "and I think that's exactly what this company needs." Right now, Monday morning arrived with the kind of California sunshine that makes you believe anything is possible, and I dressed carefully in the navy blazer I'd worn to my interview 5 years earlier, because it felt like closing a circle that had been left open for too long. I arrived at VeraCore 30 minutes early and took the elevator to the 34th floor, where Marcus's assistant directed me to a small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. "You'll wait here until we're ready for you," she said with the kind of professional smile that could mean congratulations or condolences, depending on what happened next. I sat there reviewing my notes final time and trying to prepare for both possible outcomes, accepting defeat gracefully or stepping into victory responsibly at 9:15. Marcus appeared in the doorway looking more relaxed than I'd seen him during this entire process. "Naomi," he said. It's time. I followed him into the boardroom where the full executive team was assembled for what they'd been told was a routine Monday morning leadership meeting. Claire was sitting in her usual spot at Marcus's right hand, looking confident and slightly bored, like someone who'd already heard the punchline to a joke. Everyone else was waiting for Marcus. Called the meeting to order and began with standard agenda items: quarterly performance reviews, upcoming client presentations, budget allocations for the next fiscal year, all delivered in his typical efficient style, while I sat in the chair they designated for me, trying to read the room for clues about what was coming. Then, Marcus cleared his throat in the way that usually preceded important announcements, and the energy in the room shifted as everyone realized this wasn't going to be another routine meeting. "As you all know," he began, "we've been conducting a thorough review of VeraCore's leadership structure, strategic direction over the past several weeks. This review included extensive board deliberations, careful consideration of our company's evolving needs, and input from key stakeholders about the qualities we need in our next chief executive officer." Claire was nodding along with the kind of practiced attention that suggested she was mentally preparing her gracious acceptance speech, while other executives shifted in their chairs with varying degrees of curiosity and anticipation after careful consideration of candidates and extensive discussion about VeraCore's future. Marcus continued, "The board has unanimously decided to appoint a new CEO, effective immediately, someone whose vision for ethical innovation, sustainable growth, and collaborative leadership aligns perfectly with our company's values and aspirations." I could see Claire straightening in her chair, preparing to stand and accept congratulations, when Marcus turned toward me instead. "Naomi Ibarra will be taking over as CEO of VeraCore Innovations," he said, and the silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the HVAC system humming in the walls. Claire's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so revealing. First confusion as she processed what she'd heard, then disbelief as she realized this wasn't some elaborate joke, then anger as she understood that her assumptions about her own indispensability had been completely wrong. Started to speak, probably to object or demand explanations, but Marcus held up his hand in a gesture that made it clear the decision was final and not open for discussion. "Naomi has developed a comprehensive strategy for VeraCore's next phase of growth," he continued, "and we're confident that her leadership will position us for continued success in an increasingly competitive market." I stood up slowly, trying to project the kind of calm confidence that effective leaders demonstrate during moments of transition, and walked to the front of the room where Marcus handed me a folder containing I assumed were official documents and access credentials. I looked around the table at faces displaying everything from genuine excitement to carefully concealed concern, and decided that my first words as CEO should set the tone for everything that would follow. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, "and thank you to the board for this opportunity. I know this transition represents a significant change for everyone in this room, and I want you to know that I don't take the responsibility lightly." Claire was staring at me with the kind of intensity that suggested she was trying to figure out how this happened and whether there was still some way to reverse it. But I continued speaking directly to the full team. "My priority is ensuring that VeraCore continues to lead the industry in ethical AI development, while creating an environment where our best people can do their best work. I believe sustainable success comes from collaborative leadership, transparent communication, and genuine respect for everyone's contributions." It wasn't a speech exactly, more like a statement of principles delivered in the kind of measured tone that suggests confidence without arrogance, clarity without condescension. "Over the next few weeks, I'll be meeting with each of you individually to discuss your goals, your concerns, and your vision for how we can work together to build on VeraCore's strong foundation," I said, looking directly at each person around the table, including Claire, whose expression had settled into something resembling professional composure. "For now, let's focus on the work we're all here to do," I concluded, "and let's begin the meeting." Continued with routine business items. But everything felt different. Now conversations that had been dominated by Claire's voice became more collaborative. Decisions that had been made unilaterally were suddenly open for input, and I could see people beginning to relax in ways that suggested they'd been holding tension they hadn't even realized they were carrying. When the meeting ended, Claire approached me with what looked like her best attempt at gracious professionalism. "Congratulations, Naomi," she said, extending her hand. "I'm sure you'll do great things with the company." I shook her hand and smiled, the same genuine smile I'd been practicing for years. "Thank you, Claire. I really appreciate that, and I hope we can work together to ensure a smooth transition." But I could see in her eyes that she already understood this wasn't going to be a transition where she maintained her current role and influence. This was going to be something much more fundamental and much more final. That afternoon, Layla Monroe knocked on my new office door with a thick folder and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "I thought you might want to see these," she said, placing the folder on my desk. "These are the exit interviews and HR reports I've been collecting over the past 2 years. The ones that document patterns of behavior that the previous leadership chose not to address." I opened the folder and began reading testimonials from former employees that painted a detailed picture of the toxic culture that had been allowed to flourish under Claire's leadership. Stories of discrimination, intimidation, systematic undermining of anyone who posed a potential threat to her authority. "This is exactly what we need to ensure this never happens again," I told Layla, who looked like someone who'd finally been heard after years of speaking into a void. "Things are going to be different now," she said. And first time since I'd returned to VeraCore, it sounded like a promise rather than a hope. The first article appeared in TechCrunch 3 days after my appointment as CEO, with a headline that made my stomach drop before I'd even finished reading it. "VeraCore's nepotism problem: How venture capital connections trump merit in Silicon Valley leadership," and the anonymous quotes were so specifically detailed and personally vindictive that I knew exactly who'd provided them to the reporter. Sources close to the company describe Ibarra as technically competent, but lacking the executive experience necessary for CEO-level decision-making. One quote read, "Her appointment appears to be based more on family connections than leadership qualifications, particularly given her father's previously undisclosed investment in the company." I was sitting in my new corner office reading this character assassination over my morning coffee while trying to figure out how to respond to accusations that cut right to the heart of my deepest professional insecurities. The fear that maybe I hadn't earned this position, maybe I really was just another Silicon Valley nepotism story disguised as a merit-based promotion. My phone started ringing before I'd finished the article. Reporters from 3 different publications wanting comments about the allegations. Venture capital bloggers asking pointed questions about my qualifications, and industry analysts wondering whether VeraCore's board had made a strategic error in choosing family connections over proven leadership experience. By 10 o'clock, Marcus was standing in my doorway looking like someone who'd spent his morning fielding angry calls from investors and PR consultants. We need to address this immediately, he said, closing the door behind him. The board is getting questions about our decision-making process, and some of our early investors are concerned about the optics of appointing someone whose father holds voting shares. I could feel the walls closing in because this was exactly the scenario I'd worried about when I learned about Papa's investment. The possibility that my appointment would be seen as inherited rather than earned, that everything I'd accomplished would be overshadowed by family connections I'd never even known existed. But then something interesting happened. Instead of panic or defensiveness, I felt a kind of calm clarity about who I was and what I'd actually achieved at VeraCore. Not because of my father's influence, but despite his complete absence from my professional development. Marcus, I said, looking directly at him, I understand your concerns and I think the best way to address them is with complete transparency about my qualifications, my vision for this company and my track record of results. I spent the next hour walking him through a detailed timeline of my contributions to VeraCore, from the original AI ethics framework that had become our signature offering to the client relationships I'd built during my early years to the strategic analysis that had convinced the board to offer me this position. None of these achievements, I told him, required my father's influence or intervention. They were the result of my own work, my own ideas, and my own ability to solve complex problems in ways that created value for this company. By the end of our conversation, Marcus looked like someone who'd remembered why the board had chosen me in the first place, and he agreed that the best response to these attacks would be radical transparency about my qualifications, combined with immediate action to demonstrate effective leadership. That afternoon, I called an all-hands meeting for the entire company, not just the executive team but every engineer, designer, marketing coordinator, and administrative assistant, because I wanted everyone to hear directly from me about what was happening and what it meant for VeraCore's future. I stood in front of 200 employees in our main conference space and addressed the elephant in the room, head-on. By now you've probably seen the articles questioning my appointment as CEO, I said, and I want you to hear from me directly about my qualifications for this role and my vision for our company's future. I talked about my technical background, my business education, my deep understanding of VeraCore's challenges and opportunities, and my commitment to building a culture where everyone's contributions were recognized and valued. I didn't mention Claire specifically, but I made it clear that the toxic dynamics that had been allowed to flourish under previous leadership were going to change immediately. Then I opened the floor for questions, and what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Instead of skeptical challenges or awkward silence, I got thoughtful questions about strategic direction, detailed discussions about technical innovation, and genuine enthusiasm about the cultural changes I was proposing. During the Q&A session, a young engineer named Kevin raised his hand and said something that shifted the entire energy in the room. I've been here for 3 years, he said, and this is the first time I felt like leadership actually cares about what we think about our ideas, about our experience. Working here, Naomi's presentation today showed more genuine understanding of our daily challenges than I've seen from any previous executive. Other employees started nodding and sharing similar observations about how my approach differed from what they'd experienced before, how I listened without interrupting, how I asked follow-up questions that showed I was actually processing their input, how I treated their concerns as legitimate business issues rather than HR problems managed. By the time the meeting ended, the mood had shifted from defensive uncertainty to cautious optimism, and I realized that the media attacks had actually created an opportunity to demonstrate exactly the kind of leadership style that would distinguish my tenure from Claire's. The real turning point came 2 days later, when Tamika Wells published a LinkedIn post that went viral within hours. Reading the TechCrunch article about VeraCore's new CEO, she wrote, "And I have to share my own experience with Naomi Ibarra. 5 years ago, when I was an intern at VeraCore, Claire Roth humiliated me in front of the entire engineering team for asking questions during a technical review. She made me feel stupid and unwelcome in tech." Tamika's post continued. "Naomi wasn't even my direct supervisor, but she took time to mentor me, helped me understand that my questions were actually insights team needed to hear, encouraged me to pursue my own startup. When it became clear that VeraCore wasn't ready to value diverse perspectives today, my company just signed a partnership deal with VeraCore under Naomi's leadership, because she understands that innovation comes from inclusion, intimidation. The post got shared over 3,000 times in 24 hours, with comments from other former VeraCore employees sharing their own stories about the toxic culture under Claire's leadership and their positive experiences with my mentorship and collaboration. By Friday morning, narrative had completely shifted from questions about nepotism to discussions about the importance of ethical leadership in tech companies, and by the following week, I had interview requests from Harvard Business Review and the Wall Street Journal asking me to discuss my approach to core culture transformation. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus forwarded me an email from one of our biggest clients, expressing enthusiasm about working with VeraCore under new leadership. "We've been concerned about some of the cultural issues at VeraCore," the client wrote, "but Naomi's appointment gives us confidence that the company is serious about addressing these challenges while maintaining technical excellence. We're excited to expand our partnership." That evening, I called Papa to thank him for his quiet support and to let him know how everything had unfolded. "Mija," he said, that gentle voice that had guided me through every major decision in my life. "You've always had the strength to lead. You just needed the right opportunity to show everyone else what I've always known about you." I hung up feeling like I'd finally stepped fully into the leader I'd been preparing to become for years, not because of family connections or inherited privilege, but because of everything I'd learned about resilience, integrity, and the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself through performance. The attacks had been painful, but they'd also been clarifying, forced me to articulate exactly why I deserved this position, and what I intended to do with the responsibility, and in doing so, they'd actually strengthened my authority rather than undermining it. The email arrived in my inbox at 6:43 on a Tuesday morning, with a subject line that made me pause mid-sip of my coffee. "Urgent board meeting required today, 2 p.m., and when I opened it I found a message from Marcus that was uncharacteristically direct, even by his standards. "We need to discuss Claire's future with the company immediately." The message read, "There have been developments that require immediate board action. Please review the attached documents before this afternoon's meeting." The attachments included a formal complaint filed directly with the SEC, alleging financial irregularities in VeraCore's client billing practices, specifically related to projects that Claire had overseen during the past 18 months. The complaint was detailed, thorough, and accompanied by documentation that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of our internal processes had been collecting evidence for months. I spent the morning reviewing bank records, project invoices, communications, and expense reports that painted a picture of systematic overbilling disguised as premium service charges. Claire had been inflating project costs by adding unnecessary consulting hours, billing clients for work that had been completed by junior engineers at standard rates, and claiming travel expenses for trips that had never occurred. The financial impact wasn't enormous by Silicon Valley standards, maybe $200,000 spread across multiple clients over several quarters, but the ethical implications were devastating for a company that had built its reputation for transparency and integrity in AI development. More troubling than the money was the pattern of behavior it revealed, the same entitlement and disregard for consequences that had characterized Claire's treatment of employees had apparently extended to client relationships and fiduciary responsibilities. At 2 o'clock, I walked into the boardroom to find Marcus Elliott and 3 other board members sitting around the table with the kind of grim expressions that usually preceded terminations. Claire wasn't there, which told me everything I needed to know about how this meeting was going to unfold. Marcus began by explaining that the SEC complaint had triggered an internal audit that had uncovered additional irregularities, including expense reports for conferences that Claire had never attended, client entertainment charges for events that had never happened, and consulting fees paid to firms that appeared to exist only on paper. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Claire had been using VeraCore's client relationships and expense accounts as her personal funding source for a lifestyle that exceeded what her actual salary could support. "We've already spoken with our legal team," Marcus said, "and they've advised that we have grounds for immediate termination with cause, which would void her severance package and potentially expose her to civil liability for the funds she's misappropriated." I asked whether Claire had been given an opportunity to respond to the allegations, and Marcus explained that she'd been presented with the evidence that morning and had initially denied any wrongdoing before eventually admitting to what she called minor accounting errors and judgment lapses. "She's requested a meeting with you," Elliot said, "to discuss what she's calling a transition plan that would allow her to leave gracefully while making restitution for any financial discrepancies." I realized that Claire was still trying to control the narrative, still believing she could negotiate her way out of consequences through the same charm and manipulation that had got her into this situation. But this wasn't a performance review or a client disagreement. This was a criminal matter that required criminal consequences. "I think we should hear what she has to say," I told the board, "but I also think we should be very clear about the fact that termination for cause is non-negotiable at this point. The only question is whether we pursue criminal charges or allow her to make restitution voluntarily." 30 minutes later, Claire walked into the boardroom looking like someone who'd aged 5 years overnight. Her usual polished appearance was replaced by something that looked hastily assembled and desperate. Her confidence was gone, replaced by the kind of frantic energy that comes from realizing you've finally been caught. "Naomi," she said, ignoring everyone else in the room and speaking directly to me, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about some of the expense billing practices I've been using. I never intended to violate any policies, and I'm happy to work with accounting to resolve any discrepancies." I looked at her sitting there trying to minimize criminal fraud as accounting discrepancies, and I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for the mentor she'd once been, and relief that her toxic influence on VeraCore was finally coming to an end. "Claire," I said gently, "there's no misunderstanding here. The documentation is clear and comprehensive. You've been systematically defrauding our clients and our company for over a year. This is something that can be resolved through accounting adjustments." She started to argue, but Marcus interrupted her with a termination letter that had already been prepared and signed by the board, effective immediately. "Your employment with VeraCore is terminated for cause." The letter stated all company property, including laptops, phones, and access credentials, must be returned by end of business today. "Your final paycheck will reflect salary earned through today, with no severance or benefits." Continuation. Claire stared at the letter like she was reading a foreign language, then looked around the table, as if expecting someone to intervene on her behalf, to explain that this was all an elaborate misunderstanding that could be resolved with apologies and promises. But there was no intervention because there was no misunderstanding, just consequences that had finally caught up with choices she'd been making for years. "I'll fight this," she said, standing up abruptly. "This is obviously retaliation for my opposition to Naomi's appointment. You can't terminate someone for minor expense irregularities while ignoring the real nepotism problems in this company." Marcus handed her a business card for the employment attorney the company had retained. "You're welcome to seek legal counsel," he said, "but I'd advise you to also consult with a criminal defense attorney, given the SEC complaint and our obligation to report financial irregularities to federal authorities." The color drained from Claire's face as she realized that this wasn't just about losing her job. This was about potentially losing her freedom and her professional reputation. Permanently. She walked toward the door, then turned back one final time to look at me with an expression that contained parts hatred and bewilderment. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This company will be in ruins within 6 months without real leadership." I smiled the same warm, genuine smile I'd been practicing for years. "I appreciate your concern. Claire and I wish you the best in your future endeavors." After she left, the boardroom fell silent for several minutes while we all processed what had just happened. The end of an era, the closing of a chapter, the final consequence of choices that had been building toward this moment for years. That's probably the most satisfying termination I've ever witnessed, Elliot said finally, and I think I speak for the entire board when I say we should have done this. Months ago I nodded, but I was already thinking ahead to the work that needed to be done, the culture that needed to be rebuilt, the trust that needed to be restored, and the leadership that needed to be demonstrated. Every single day going forward. Claire's exit was the end of one story, but it was also the beginning of another one, and I was ready to write that next chapter with the same quiet confidence that had brought me to this moment. Morning after Claire's termination, I walked into VeraCore to find something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine excitement radiating from our employees, the kind of energy that comes from people who suddenly realize they can breathe freely in their own workplace, that they can speak honestly about their ideas without fear of retaliation, and that their contributions might actually be recognized rather than appropriated. Layla Monroe was waiting in my office with a stack of documents and an expression that suggested she'd been planning this conversation since the day she was hired. These are diversity and inclusion initiatives I've been developing for the past 2 years, she said, placing the folder on my desk, the ones that previous leadership wasn't interested in implementing. I think now might be the right time to revisit some of these proposals. I spent the next hour reviewing comprehensive plans for salary equity audits, unconscious bias training, flexible work arrangements, mentorship programs for underrepresented employees, and transparent promotion criteria that would prevent the kind of favoritism and gatekeeping that had characterized Claire's tenure. Everything in the folder represents exactly the kind of systematic change we need to make. I told Layla, and I want you to know that implementing these initiatives isn't just a priority for me, it's going to be the foundation of how we rebuild this company's culture. We started with the salary audit, because pay affects everything from employee morale to retention rates, to our ability to attract top talent. Layla had already done preliminary research that revealed significant disparities between male and female employees at equivalent levels, and between white employees and employees of color with similar experience and qualifications. The data was both shocking and completely predictable. Women at VeraCore were earning an average of 23% less than their male counterparts for identical roles. Employees of color were concentrated in junior positions, despite having technical qualifications that should have led to advancement opportunities, and the promotion pipeline systematically favored people who looked and sounded like Claire. Fixing this wasn't just about adjusting current salaries, it was about acknowledging that our previous leadership had created a system that perpetuated inequality and committing to transparency that would prevent these disparities from recurring. I announced the salary audit at an all-hands meeting, and committed to completing the analysis within 60 days, with adjustments retroactive to the beginning of the fiscal year. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Employees who'd felt undervalued for years suddenly had hope that their contributions would be recognized fairly. But the most meaningful change came from something simpler and more fundamental than policy adjustments. I started holding weekly open forums where any employee could bring ideas, concerns, questions, or feedback directly to leadership without going through layers of management or worrying about political consequences. The first forum attracted maybe 20 people, mostly senior engineers, who were curious to see whether this was genuine engagement or just another corporate theater exercise. But by the 4th week we had to move to a larger conference room to accommodate everyone who wanted to participate during these sessions. I learned things about VeraCore that I'd never understood from the executive level: how our junior engineers were developing innovative solutions that never reached leadership attention, how our client service team was hearing market feedback that could inform product development, how our administrative staff was managing processes that could be streamlined to improve efficiency across the entire organization. More importantly, I learned about the human cost of Claire's leadership style, the stress-related health issues that several employees had developed, the promising careers that had been derailed by public humiliation, the innovative projects that had been abandoned because their creator had been marginalized or driven away. One of the most powerful moments came during our 6th open forum, when a software engineer named Maria stood up to share her experience for 3 years. "I've been working on machine learning algorithms that could revolutionize how we detect bias in AI systems," said. "But every time I tried to present my research, Claire would either dismiss it as too theoretical or claim it wasn't aligned with company priorities. Last week, Naomi asked me to present my findings to the board, and they've approved a 6-month pilot program to develop this into a commercial product." The room erupted in applause because Maria's story represented something larger than individual recognition. It represented a fundamental shift in how we identified, developed, and rewarded innovation. I promoted Layla to Chief People Officer because her insights about organizational psychology and her commitment to equity made her exactly the kind of leader we needed to guide our cultural transformation. I also created new positions for employees who'd been underutilized under previous leadership, including a Chief Innovation Officer role for Maria and a Director of Client Relations position for someone who'd been stuck in an administrative role despite having an MBA and 5 years of account management experience. Within 6 months, our employee satisfaction scores had increased by 40%. Our turnover rate had dropped to the lowest level in company history, and we were receiving unsolicited applications from top talent who wanted to work for a company that was gaining a reputation for ethical leadership and inclusive culture. But the change I was most proud of was subtler and harder to measure: the way people carried themselves in the office, the way conversations happened in hallways, the way ideas were shared in meetings without fear of theft or ridicule. Tamika Wells became one of our most valuable partners. Her startup was developing educational AI tools that complemented our ethical framework perfectly, and working with her reminded me daily about the ripple effects of mentorship and support. During her first visit to VeraCore under my leadership, she pulled me aside and said something that I'll never forget. "You know, the difference between you and Claire," she said, "isn't just that you're kinder, although you are. It's that you understand that build people up makes you stronger while tearing people down makes you smaller and weaker and lonelier." That observation captured something essential about leadership that I'd learned through years of watching Claire's rise and fall. True authority comes from empowering others, not from controlling them. Sustainable success comes from creating environments where everyone can contribute their best work, not from hoarding credit and eliminating competition. 6 months after Claire's departure, VeraCore was featured on the cover of Fast Company as one of the most innovative and ethically driven company in Silicon Valley. But more meaningful to me than the external recognition was the internal transformation we'd achieved. People were excited to come to work again. They were proud to tell their friends and family where they worked. They were contributing ideas and innovations that were making our products better and our clients happier, and they were building careers that felt meaningful and sustainable. One evening, as I was leaving the office, late after a particularly productive day, I ran into Kevin, the young engineer who'd spoken up during my first all-hands meeting. "Thanks for giving us company back," he said, and I realized that was exactly what we'd accomplished. We'd reclaimed VeraCore from the toxic culture that had been suffocating its potential, and restored it to the vision that had originally inspired all of us to work there. The rebuilding was ongoing and would always be ongoing, because creating inclusive, ethical, sustainable culture isn't a project you complete, it's a commitment you renew every single day, through every decision you make and every interaction you have. But for the first time since returning to VeraCore, I felt confident that we were building something that would last, something that would continue growing and evolving and inspiring long after I eventually moved on to whatever came next, and that felt like the kind of legacy worth building. The email from Harvard Business Review arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing quarter projections and trying to process the fact that VeraCore had just posted our highest employee satisfaction scores in company history, alongside record-breaking revenue numbers that proved sustainable culture and business success weren't mutually exclusive. "Ms. Ibarra," the message began, "we'd like to feature your leadership transformation at VeraCore in an upcoming cover story about ethical leadership in tech. We're particularly interested in your perspective on how companies can rebuild trust and culture after periods of toxic leadership. Would you be available for an in-depth interview next week? I stared at that email for a long time because agreeing to this kind of profile meant telling my story publicly in ways that could be dissected, analyzed, and potentially misunderstood by people who hadn't lived through the complex dynamics that had brought me to this position. But I also realized that sharing these experiences honestly might help other leaders navigate similar challenges in their own organization.